First thing Mara noticed was that the ship was still burning. It hung above the tree line like a second sun, asymmetrical, wounded, trailing a scar of smoke across the pale morning sky. The Vorkai vessel had come down hard 3 kilometers east, and even now, hours after impact, still cooking. She could smell the metal from here, alien alloy. It had an almost sweet quality, like burnt copper wire, and something she couldn't name. Something that didn't exist in any human chemistry she'd ever learned. She stood at the edge of the ridge and looked at it for a long time. Behind her, in the ruin of what used to be the Whitmore Station Communications Relay, 4 other people were still arguing about whether to light a fire. "They'll see the smoke," said Okoro. He was a big man, former network infrastructure tech, who had been on his 3rd rotation at Whitmore, when the invasion fleet dropped out of slip space and turned the southern hemisphere into a storm of electromagnetic interference and fire. He had the look of a man who had been useful every day of his adult life and was furious to find himself not useful now. "They can already see us," said Priya, not looking up from the panel she was trying to pry open. She was small and meticulous, a signal analyst who had the habit of speaking in the same flat tone, whether she was reporting routine packet traffic or watching alien atmospheric processors reshape the sky. "If they were going to come here, they would have come already. They're not interested in 12 surviving personnel in a broken relay station." "We were 12, said Finn. Nobody answered that. Finn was the youngest of them, barely 22. A maintenance apprentice whose actual job title had been something involving the words junior and auxiliary, stacked together in a way that meant he was the person who unclogged the water recyclers. He was sitting in the corner with his knees drawn up, and he had been saying variations of that sentence for the past 6 hours in the careful way of persons who was trying very hard not to cry and mostly succeeding. The 5th person was Dr. Yevgeny Asar, who was not arguing about the fire and was not working on the panel and was not sitting in any corner. She was standing in the middle of the room, reading from a small notebook she'd produced from somewhere inside her coat, making occasional marks in it with a pencil stub. She had been the station's resident xenobiologist, which meant she'd spent the last 18 months studying microorganism samples brought back from the Kepler survey missions, and now she was the only one of them who had any professional framework for thinking about what was happening. She was the one who finally broke the silence. "The vessel that came down," she said. "I need someone to go look at it." Okoro stared at her. "The burning alien warship." "The burning alien warship," she confirmed. "You want us to go look at it?" "I want someone to go look at it." She made another mark in her notebook. "Not all of us. 1 or 2 quietly." "Why?" said Priya, and it wasn't a question, it was a request for data. "Because I think it came down. Because something went wrong inside it." "Not because we shot it down. We don't have anything that could shoot it down. So something went wrong on its own. And if something went wrong on its own, I want to know what it was." She looked up then. Eyes were the kind of dark that looked almost purple in low light, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had spent her career in careful company of things that could kill her if she stopped paying attention. Microorganisms, airborne pathogens, the invisible architecture of biological systems that had no concept of human survival and no particular malice either. Just systems, just function. Nation is the only advantage we have, she said. And right now we have almost none. Mara had been standing in the doorway this whole time. She'd come back from the ridge to get water and had forgotten the water. "I'll go," she said. Yevgenia looked at her. "You were a surveyor?" "Geological. Mostly remote sensing, some ground truth work." Mara picked up her water bottle from the table, because she'd come back for it, and it would be stupid not to take it. "I know how to move through terrain and not make noise about it." Toro started to object. She looked at him, and whatever he saw in her face stopped him mid-breath. "I'll be back before dark," she said. She wasn't. The forest between the relay station and the crash site was a mixed boreal type, spruce and birch and the occasional larch, and it was completely still in a way that forests should not be. No wind, no birds. The birds had gone sometime in the first hours of the invasion, startled out of the trees by the electromagnetic disruption, and they hadn't come back. Mara moved through the silence, with her field kit on her back, and her geological hammer in her hand. Not because it was useful, but because the weight of it was comforting, and she was honest enough with herself to need comforting. She heard the ship before she saw it. It was making a sound she could only describe as breathing, a low, rhythmic mechanical exhale, like something vast was still running its systems even as it burned. The sound came up through the ground into the soles of her boots. The trees thinned, and then she was at the edge of the clearing. The ship was enormous. She'd known this from the ridge. It had blocked the sky when it came down. But knowing and seeing were different things. It had torn a furrow through the forest 200 meters long before stopping, and what it had left behind was a chaos of shattered timber and upturned soil and alien debris. The hull had folded in places, accordion crumpled, and through the gaps she could see the internal structure. Curved organic-seeming corridors, material that was neither metal nor plastic but something in between. The smell was stronger here, that sweet copper wrongness. There were no survivors. She could tell that from the stillness of it. Whatever had been inside was either dead or had left. She moved closer anyway. The breach in the hull on the western side was wide enough to walk through if she ducked. She stood at the edge of it for a long moment, then went in. The inside of the Vorkai ship was, she would later struggle to find the word. Dark was wrong. There was a faint bioluminescence from the walls, cold blue-green, that made everything visible in the same way a deep ocean photograph is visible. Quiet was wrong. Breathing sound was louder in here, insistent, and underneath it she could now make out something else. A tone. A very low, steady tone that she felt in her back teeth more than heard. She moved through what she thought might be a corridor. The Vorkai were by then known quantities in the broad strokes, bipedal, taller than humans by a significant margin, bilateral symmetry that rhymed with mammalian biology without quite matching it. The survey teams had established rough physiological baselines from recovered materials in the year before the invasion, and there'd been a period of about 4 months where xenobiology community had been cautiously optimistic about contact protocols. That period was over. What the survey teams hadn't established, because they hadn't had the opportunity, was how the Vorkai built things. Mara moved through the ship and looked at how the Vorkai built things. Everything was grown. That was the word that kept coming to her. Not manufactured, not engineered. The corridors were more like the interior of a body than the interior of a machine. Smooth membraned surfaces, structural elements that tapered to fine points, and then rejoined. Junctions that branched and rebranched like capillaries. She could see the remnants of what might have been a control interface. A surface near what she guessed was the forward section, covered in small nodules, and she had the uncomfortable sense that operating it would have involved touching things rather than pressing them, sensation rather than mechanism. She was thinking about this, thinking hard, the way she thought about geological strata, about what the structure implied about the minds that had built it. When she found the surviving Vorkai, it was in what she would later decide was a crew quarters section, curled against the wall, in a posture that looked, despite every difference, pain. It was approximately 2 meters and 20 centimeters tall when uncurled, she estimated, 4-limbed. Its integument was a dark gray-green, slightly iridescent in the bioluminescent light. Its face. She would not think of it as a face. She would call it the anterior sensory cluster. She would be scientific about this. Was partially obscured by what might have been its equivalent of a hand covering its eyes. It was injured. She could see that. The left side of its body showed damage consistent with blunt force trauma, and one of its lower limbs was bent at an angle that was wrong even for a being with different skeletal architecture. Became aware of her approximately 3 seconds after she became aware of it. What happened next was the part of the story she would have the hardest time explaining later. Not the biological fact of it. The way its sensory cluster oriented toward her, the involuntary sound it made, something between a click and a subsonic hum that she felt more in her sternum than heard. Not even the way it moved, trying to put its back to the wall and finding it couldn't, not with the injured limb. Those things she could describe. What she had trouble describing was the quality of the eye contact. If it was eye contact. The anterior sensory cluster of a Vorkai did not have eyes in any human sense. No iris, no sclera, nothing like a pupil. What it had was a set of structures that seemed designed to take in information. And in this moment, those structures were taking in Mara, and Mara was taking in the Vorkai, and there was something in the exchange that was entirely legible despite the fact that they had no shared language and no shared biology and nothing in common except that they were both alive in a broken ship that smelled of burning metal. She was terrified of it. That was the first thing. The second thing was that it was terrified of her. She slowly lowered herself to sitting, cross-legged, on the floor of the alien ship. She set her geological hammer down beside her, in full view, and did not touch it again. They stayed like that for a long time. "You came back with a what?" said Okoro. "I didn't bring it back. I came back to get supplies. Still in the ship." "It's still in the... It's injured. It can't move well. It can't fly the ship. The ship is destroyed, or close enough. Not a threat." Yevgenia had her notebook out. "Describe the injury." Mara described the injury. Yevgenia listened with her pencil moving. And when Mara was done, she said, "Probably equivalent to a fractured pelvis. Debilitating. Wouldn't kill it quickly but would prevent mobility." "Not field surgeons for an alien army," said Okoro. "No," said Yevgenia. "We're xenobiologists, or one of us is." She paused. "And geologists, and signal analysts, and maintenance technicians. But what we are above all else is people who are still alive in a situation where most people aren't, and that means we have to be strategic about every possible advantage." Okoro looked at the ceiling. It was the look of a man who knew he was going to lose an argument and wanted to register his objection to the universe before conceding. It's a soldier in an invasion force that is actively killing people. It's a soldier in an invasion force with a broken pelvis who is alone in a ship. Yes, Yevgenia closed her notebook, and it saw Mara and did not attempt to harm her, which tells us something. It tells us it couldn't, maybe, or it tells us it didn't. The silent, stretched Finn, from his corner, said, "Are we going back?" Mara looked at him. He was young and frightened, and had been saying variations of "we were 12 for 6 hours. In his face now was different. Something that was not hope exactly. Hope seemed too large a word for what was in the room, but something that was adjacent to it. The look of a person who had been waiting for a task. "Yeah," Mara said. "We're going back." They brought what they had, which was not much. Medical supplies from the station's standard kit. Food, because they didn't know if the Vorkai ate anything a human would recognize as food. But they had to start somewhere. A portable light source. Priya brought a signal scanner. Because Priya brought a signal scanner, the way some people brought a comfort object. Not because it was always useful, because having it made her feel like herself. The Vorkai was where Mara had left it. It watched them come in, all 5 of them. Mara went first, and the others followed, and she moved slowly and kept her hands visible and kept her voice low and calm. Even though she was talking, complete nonsense, just words, just sound, just the human register of "I am not a threat." Every species that has ever lived in a group of other things has learned to broadcast somehow. The Vorkai did not move, did not make the clicking hum sound again. Its sensory cluster tracked each of them in turn, resting finally on Yevgenia, crouched down to look at the injured limb from a distance. "Comparable to femur fracture with probable pelvic involvement," she murmured. "Nothing I can do about the structural damage, but I can try to reduce the pain response." "How do you know what reduces pain for a Vorkai?" Finn asked. "I don't," she said, "but I can extrapolate from the tissue samples we have on record about neurochemical signaling systems. Anti-inflammatories might cross the physiological gap. Temperature reduction at the injury site might help. That seems to be fairly universal across bilateral organisms with centralized nervous systems. We try things." She opened the medical kit and began working methodically, narrating everything she did in a low, steady voice as she did it. And whether the narration was for her colleagues, or the Vorkai, or herself, Mara couldn't tell. It didn't matter. The sound was useful. Okoro stood by the breach in the hull and watched the tree line. That was useful too. Priya turned on her scanner and very quietly began taking readings of the interior of the ship, the bioluminescence, the tone in the walls. She said nothing about what she was finding, but she moved with the slow precision of someone who had found a vein of something. Or sat near the Vorkai and did nothing useful at all. She just sat. After an hour, the Vorkai made a sound. not the clicking hum. Something different. Longer. Almost. Did that sound intentional? Finn said. Everything it does is intentional, Yevgenia said without looking up. The sound came again. Then, with a careful deliberateness that was almost painful to watch, the Vorkai turned its sensory cluster toward Mara and made a shorter sound. Then it turned toward Yevgenia and made a different sound. Then it repeated them. Mara felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. It's naming us, Finn said very quietly. Or tagging us, Priya said. Be functional categorization. This one encountered me first, so it has a label. This one treated my injury. Different label. Could be both, Yevgenia said. Functionally equivalent. Mara repeated the sound it had used for her. It wasn't quite right. Her vocal anatomy wasn't built for the precise resonances the Vorkai could produce. But she got close. The Vorkai's sensory cluster oriented directly toward her. She had the absolute certainty, without evidence, that she had its complete attention. She pointed to herself. Mara, she said. She did it 3 more times before she was sure it was listening. Then she stopped and waited. The wait was 6.5 minutes. She counted, later, because it had felt both like an eternity and like no time at all. Then the Vorkai produced a sound. Close to what she'd said, not identical. Shh. The architecture of its vocal system was different enough from hers that it couldn't quite get the long vowel. But the consonants were there, the M was there, and the shape of the word was recognizable. Something happened in Mara's chest that she could not have named and did not try to. Hello, she said. They did not fix everything in 1 night or 1 week or even 1 month. That is not a story that happened, or that could have happened. Language is not something that appears between people, between beings. It is something that grows, and growing takes time and time has costs. What they did in those first days was establish a vocabulary of about 40 concepts. Emergency shelter, water, pain, no pain, yes, no. The orbital fleet, and here the Vorkai produced a complex series of tones that Priya recorded and analyzed and decided meant something like superiors or commanders or those above. Danger, safety, them, us. That last one was complicated. The Vorkai, whose designation in its own language was a chord of 3 simultaneous tones that no human could produce, and whom Fifth had therefore begun calling 3 in the privacy of their group, and then less privately, and then simply, had been part of the initial invasion assessment team, a ship of 12 sent to evaluate what resistance capacity the ground-level infrastructure represented. All other 11 were dead. The ship had been brought down by something that wasn't human. Something 3 communicated in a series of sounds that clustered around the concepts, wrong and internal and not intended. A systems failure. A biological failure, possibly. Something about the growth architecture of the ship. A corridor of cellular structure that had developed incorrectly. A structural integrity compromise that their sensors had identified too late. The invasion fleet was in orbit. It had deployed its atmospheric processors and it was remaking the air. Not quickly, it was a process of years, not months, and the humans who understood atmospheric chemistry had pointed out, in the first days, that the Vorkai baseline atmosphere requirements were not so different from human requirements, that the changes would be immediately lethal. But they were different enough that an extended transition would be. The math was not on humanity's side. 3 knew this. Mara was not sure if 3 had always known this, or if knowing it became different when there were 5 human faces to attach it to. She thought about that a lot. The question of what knowing means when it becomes personal. It was Priya who found the frequency. She found it 3 weeks in at 2 in the morning when everyone else was asleep except Okoro, who was on watch and had his eyes on the sky and not Priya. She came and found Mara in the corner she'd claimed as a sleeping spot and shook her by the shoulder. Come see this, she said. The scanner was showing a signal, not a Vorkai signal. Those had their own signature by now, that deep tone resonance that showed up on the scanner as a broad spectral spike. This was tighter, more structured. Human-built frequency pattern. Someone else is out there, Mara said. Someone else is transmitting, on a frequency that would be pretty difficult to detect unless you were scanning for it specifically. Priya's voice was absolutely flat, which suggests they knew someone might be scanning for it. Can you triangulate? Takes time, but yes, do it. Priya sat down and did it. Mara sat next to her and watched. After a while, she became aware that 3 was also awake and watching from across the room, and she wondered, not for the first time, what it made of this. A small group of organisms hiding in a broken ship, working on devices it couldn't interface with, plotting something in a language it was still learning to parse. She wondered if she would have trusted them. She thought she probably wouldn't have. And she thought that 3 probably knew that, came closer, and made the sound it used for question. Mara held up a finger, one moment. Then she thought better of it. That gesture wasn't universal, and she'd learned not to assume, and produced the sound that meant wait. 3 waited. The triangulation came back in 2 hours. There was a group of survivors 40 kilometers northeast, in what had been a logistics hub, before the fleet came down. They were actively trying to communicate without being detected, which meant they were operating with some understanding of Vorkai scanning patterns, which meant they had information. "We need to reach them," Mara said. "We need to decide something first," said Priya. She didn't say what. She didn't have to. Mara looked at 3, on the other side of the room. 3 was watching them, 40 kilometers through territory that the orbital fleet surveilled. They couldn't do it alone. They needed someone who understood how the Vorki sensors worked, what signatures to avoid, what windows of transit were possible. They needed an insider. The conversation with 3 took the better part of 2 days. Not because 3 didn't understand what they were asking. By this point, their shared vocabulary had grown to nearly 300 concepts, and Mara had become reasonably good at working around the gaps. The difficulty was not communication. The difficulty was the thing itself. 3 had been part of an invasion force. The invasion was ongoing. The commanders were in orbit, and 3 presumably owed them loyalty of some kind, or, at minimum, had structured its entire existence around something that included them. What Mara was asking was for 3 to help 5 humans move undetected through a surveillance network that 3's own fleet had built. She did not try to frame it as anything other than what it was. She laid out the situation, the signal, the survivors, the distance, the difficulty. And then she said the word for help, clearly. And then she said the word for us, which now included 3 in its referent. And she did not say anything else. 3 was still for a long time. Then it made a sound she hadn't heard before. Not in their shared vocabulary. She filed it away. She'd become a collector of Vorkai sounds, in the way a person becomes a collector of something when their survival depends on the collection, and waited. Then 3 produced, slowly and deliberately, the chord of tones that was its own name, followed by Mara's name, followed by the sound that meant same. She understood it. She would have argued, with a linguist, about whether understanding it constituted proof that it meant what she thought it meant. But she understood it. Same. Whatever that meant to 3. Same species, same situation, same group, the same category of being that was here, alive, surviving. 3 was putting itself in it. Okoro, when she told him, was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. 3 communicated the surveillance patterns. Through a combination of the tones it used for the ship's navigational system. Patterns of sound, Priya recorded and analyzed, and built into a rough timing map. And through physical demonstration, scratching shapes into the floor of the ship with the tip of one limb. A kind of cartography. Not the cartography humans used. Not grid-referenced and north-oriented, but something more like a map of time. When here is safe, when there is watched, the windows of transit. Mara studied that map the way she'd studied geological surveys. Looking for the patterns inside the patterns, the underlying logic that would let her predict what wasn't explicitly marked. She stayed up 3 nights running, until Yevgenia made her sleep by the expedient of sitting next to her, and not saying anything, until Mara's eyes fell closed from pure social pressure. She woke up knowing something she hadn't known when she'd fallen asleep. The processors, she said, when she'd gathered enough consciousness to form sentences. Yevgenia was still there, still making marks in her notebook. The atmospheric processors. Can you model what happens if one goes offline? Yevgenia looked at her. I can try. Based on what Priya's recorded, not all of them. 1 or 2. Are you thinking? I'm thinking the processors are the only part of this that has a timeline. Everything else, the occupation, surveillance, the fleet in orbit, that can wait us out. But the atmospheric transition has to proceed on schedule or the whole thing doesn't work. If they're behind schedule, they need to accelerate. If they need to accelerate, they need to commit resources to the processors specifically, which means they pull those resources from somewhere else, Yevgenia said. Which means somewhere else gets lighter. Yevgenia closed her notebook. Then she opened it again to a new page and began drawing something. I'll need to model it, but yes. Theoretically. She paused. You're thinking like a geologist. What does that mean? Straighta. You look at the layers. You don't ask what's on the surface. You ask what the surface is resting on. She made another mark. It's not a bad way to think about an invasion. It took them 11 days to reach the logistics hub. They moved at night, in 3-hour windows that 3 had identified as scanner quiet. Gaps in the Vorkai surveillance pattern, created by the orbital mechanics of the monitoring satellites, because even the most advanced alien fleet could not make a satellite orbit on a schedule that left no gaps. And the gaps were there if you knew how to look. 3 moved with them. Its injured limb had improved enough for slow travel, with a brace that Yevgenia and Finn had improvised from materials they'd salvaged from the relay station and the ship. It was not comfortable. It moved anyway. On the 4th night, they were crossing a stretch of open terrain, an old agricultural field, gone to seed, ground hard with early frost, when the overhead scanner passed. Beams swept the field and Mara pressed herself flat and did not breathe. 3, beside her, also pressed flat, mimicking the posture exactly, even though its limb clearly hurt to do it. The scanner passed. Mara breathed. She turned to look at 3, and 3's sensory cluster was already oriented toward her. And she produced the sound that meant okay. 3 produced the sound that meant okay. On the 8th night, Finn slipped and made a sound, and they went still for 40 minutes in the lee of fall while Okuro watched the sky with his jaw clenched. Nothing came. They moved on. On the 11th day at first light, they reached the logistics hub. There were 43 people there. 43 people who had been doing exactly what Mara's group had been doing. Surviving, hiding, gathering information. For 3 months. More resources and more structured organization. They had a former military officer named Vasquez who had built the signal transmission system. They had engineers who had managed to extract and analyze data from 3 different Vorkai signal intercepts. They had a detailed map of the atmospheric processor network. They were also at approximately the end of their options. Processors were at 80% capacity, ahead of schedule. The timeline compression meant the atmospheric transition was going to reach critical thresholds in 8 months instead of 14. They had been trying to figure out how to disable or slow the processors with human technology, and the fundamental problem was that human technology had no purchase on the processors. The processors were biological, grown, like the ships. They ran on processes that electronic systems couldn't interface with. Mara stood in the middle of the logistics hub, surrounded by 43 people who had been surviving and working and thinking, and she felt the weight of what she'd brought with her. 3 stood next to her. There was a silence in the room when it walked in that was different from every other silence Mara had experienced. It wasn't panic. These were people who had been living adjacent to the Vorkai for months, who had studied them from a distance, and were not naive about what they were. But it was deep. It was the silence of something that didn't have a name yet. Mara didn't let it last. This is 3, she said. It's been traveling with us for 11 days. It's going to help us figure out how to shut down the processors. The word 3 used for the processors translated in their shared vocabulary to something like growing nodes or living architecture. They were not machines. They were organisms, engineered specifically for atmospheric conversion, built to consume existing atmospheric compounds and produce the Vorkai baseline mix, drawing energy from a combination of geothermal and biological processes that made them essentially self-sustaining. They could not be bombed. The human survivors had wargamed this. Even if they could build a delivery mechanism, destroying a processor physically would release the compounds it had already produced, which would accelerate the transition, not halt it. They could not be hacked, no interface. What 3 told them, in a conversation that took 6 hours and required Priya and the military signals, engineer and two of the hub's analysts to work together, building a translation framework from everything Mara's grump had learned, was that the processors could be stopped the same way the ship had been stopped. Internal failure. The processors were grown. The same cellular architecture that made them self-sustaining also made them subject to the same risks as any biological system. They had immune responses. They had stress mechanisms. They had conditions under which their own growth patterns would turn against themselves. Not virus, not sabotage, just the basic biological fact that any sufficiently complex organism can be pushed past its tolerance. 3 knew what those conditions were. 3 had been part of the team that designed the tolerance parameters. Back before the invasion, back when it had been doing the work the Vorkai equivalent of an environmental systems engineer does. It had never expected that knowledge to be useful in the opposite direction. It had never, presumably, expected a lot of things. Vasquez, the military officer, sat across from 3 in the logistics hub and said, through Mara's translation, "Why are you telling us this?" 3 made the sound that meant question, meaning, "Which part? Why are you helping us?" Mara translated. 3 was still for a moment. Ch. Then it produced a sequence of tones that took her several minutes to work through, because some of the vocabulary was new and she had to reconstruct from context. When she was done, she said, "I think it's saying, what the fleet is doing is not wrong. It doesn't have that concept framed that way, but unnecessary. It's saying there was another way, and the commanders chose this way, and 3 disagreed, and there are apparently things equivalent to dissenting in Vorkai society, and 3 had done something like that before the mission departed. And the response was the assignment to this survey vessel." She paused, which was probably not considered a prestigious posting. Vasquez looked at 3 for a long time. 3 looked back. "Can it be done from here?" Vasquez asked. It could not be done from there. It required proximity to the processor network, not physical contact, within range of the processor's own biological signaling systems, close enough to introduce the cascade compounds that 3 specified, in concentrations that 3 calculated with the precision of someone who had spent years working with exactly these tolerances. Marar volunteered immediately. "You're not a chemist," said Vasquez. "No, but I know how to move through terrain and I know how to read a map. There are 56 people here now with 3 can only communicate this to me," Mara said. It wasn't quite true. 3 and Priya had developed a decent working framework by now, but it was true enough. And this has to be done by someone 3 trusts. The word trust sat in the room for a moment. Nobody objected to it. "Okay," said Vasquez. "Do you need?" What she needed was 3 nights. 3 knew the processor locations. 3 knew the surveillance gaps better than anyone. Having helped design the satellite network's deployment pattern, it had the equivalent of a conscience about this. Mara could hear it in the way it talked about the fleet system, a tone that was not quite regret and not quite shame, but was in the same territory, and it used that knowledge with precision that surprised even Priya, who had built the timing map in the first place. Okoro came with her. He didn't ask permission. He simply was there, at the edge of the camp, pack on his back, face set in the expression of a man who has calculated the relevant variables and made his decision and is done talking about it. Finn came to the edge of the camp to see them off. He'd found something, in the hub, a role, a way of being useful. Something involving the communications infrastructure that apparently benefited from someone who understood water recyclers, auxiliary systems, and the unglamorous hidden architecture of things. He looked steadier than he had. Not healed, not over anything, but steadier. "Come back," he said. It wasn't a question. Mara treated it as a fact. "Yes," she said. The first processor was easy, easier than she'd expected, which made her suspicious of herself. She'd learned, in geology, that easy was often just hard waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The cascade compounds, mixed to 3 specifications from the biochemical precursors the hub's engineers had managed to synthesize over the past week, were a fine mist delivered upwind of the processor's intake structures, and the delivery took less than 8 minutes. 3, crouching in the dark next to her, watched the processor's bioluminescence change color, blue-green to blue-gray, then gray. A minute after that, it stopped producing anything. 3 made a sound that Mara had never heard before. She filed it away. She thought, later, that it might have been something like grief, or its Vorkai equivalent. The sound of someone who was good at a thing, watching that thing used, wrongly, and then watching it stop. She put her hand on 3's arm. Not her hand on its arm exactly, the anatomy wasn't right for that, but her hand adjacent to its arm, close enough that contact was possible if wanted. 3 held still. Then it moved, a small deliberate motion, until the contact was actual rather than approximate. They stayed like that for about 30 seconds. Then Okoro said, very quietly, "We have a window." They moved. The second processor was harder. The surveillance gap was narrower, 40 minutes rather than 3 hours, and processor itself was larger. With the more complex intake architecture, that meant the delivery had to be precise. 3 calculated the approach angles with a kind of focused intensity that Mara recognized as the same thing she felt when she was reading Strata, when she was trying to understand what the rock was telling her about deep time and deep process. They did it in 37 minutes. Third processor, they nearly didn't make it out. The orbital monitoring had shifted, not randomly, as the timing map predicted it would, deliberately responding to something. A signal, perhaps. An alert from one of the downed processors. The surveillance satellite made a second pass over their location 18 minutes ahead of schedule, and Mara and Okoro had 6 seconds of warning from 3, which pressed itself flat and produced the sound that meant down now, and they were flat before the beam swept, and it missed them by a margin that Mara chose not to calculate afterward. They lay in the dark for 22 minutes. 3's breathing was audible, that regular mechanical biological sound, but now she could hear the stress register in it, the elevated rate of something equivalent to adrenaline. She made the sound that meant okay. 3, very quietly, made the sound that meant working on it. She almost laughed. It was the first time she'd almost laughed in 4 months, and it felt very strange, like flexing a muscle she'd forgotten she had. They delivered the third compound in 9 minutes, flat, because 9 minutes was all they had, and then they were moving through the forest at a pace that didn't qualify as quiet, but was the compromise between quiet and fast that the situation required, and 3 was keeping up on a damaged limb without complaint, and Okoro was beside her breathing hard but steady, and the sky behind them was beginning to show the blue-gray of a processor going offline. 3 processors was not enough. Mara had known that, going in. 3 processors was a proof. It was a demonstration. It was 43 people, and 1 Vorkai sending a message in the only language that the orbital fleet would have to respond to. "We understand your system better than you think." The atmospheric processors had an auto-repair function. 3 had explained this from the beginning. The biology would attempt to recover, and might succeed, and the commander's response to the attack would be to accelerate the remaining processors and shore up the compromised ones, which was exactly what Mara and Vasquez and 3 had planned for. Because what the orbital fleet didn't know, what they couldn't know, because 3 hadn't transmitted anything to them, and because the concept was sufficiently alien to Vorkai strategic thinking, that it hadn't occurred to them, was that in the months since the invasion, the 43 survivors in the logistics hub hadn't just been hiding. They'd been building, not weapons, not defenses, infrastructure. A network. The signals Priya and Vasquez had been transmitting, carefully, in Windows 3 identified, had reached other survivor groups. 8 of them, in the end, spread across what used to be the region. And those groups had been synthesizing cascade compounds from the same specifications, and working with the timing maps 3 had helped build, and waiting for the signal. The attack on 3 processors was the signal. When the fleet accelerated the remaining processors, they discovered that the remaining processors were already compromised. Not all of them. The groups had varied resources and varying success rates. Enough. Enough that the atmospheric transition timeline didn't compress. It collapsed. Processors needed to be taken offline for biological repair. And during the time they were offline, the composition of the lower atmosphere snapped back toward its baseline, and the upper atmosphere compounds that the fleet had been accumulating began to dissipate. It wasn't permanent. That was what Yevgenia kept saying. Team. in the communications that began to flow more openly once the surveillance network was disrupted. It was not permanent, and they should not mistake it for victory. It was time. But time was what they needed. First, off-planet signal reached the Kepler relay stations. The parts of the network that had remained functional, on the stations the Vorkai had considered worth destroying, because ground-level communication infrastructure seemed, to an orbital invasion force, like a concern for later, within 3 weeks of the processor disruption. The signal carried everything: the processor architecture, the cascade compound specifications, the surveillance gap data, the vulnerability maps. Everything 3 had given them, and everything they'd built from it. It also carried a record of 3's name chord, the 3-tone designation that no human could produce exactly, but that was recognizable enough now for what it was. Not a prisoner, not a collaborator, something that didn't have a clean human word yet, something that would need one. The response from the off-planet stations took 6 weeks, which was the minimum possible given the distance and the relay configurations. When it came, it was long and formal and full of language about coalition forces and counter-invasion protocols, and Vasquez read it twice before he handed it to Mara. She read it once. Then she went to find 3. 3 was outside, in the spot it had claimed as its own. A section of the logistics hub's eastern wall, where the angle of the morning light was apparently agreeable. To it, for reasons Mara had never fully understood, but had stopped questioning. It spent a lot of time there, looking at the sky. She had wondered if this was grief, or hope, or something Vorkai-specific that had no human analog. She sat down next to it, made the sound for question. 3 produced a sequence of tones. She worked through it. Something like your people, or those who belong with you. Coming, she said, slowly, but coming. 3 made the sound that meant understood. Then it made a sound that she hadn't heard in months. The first complex sound it had ever produced at her. Back in the burning ship, the sound she'd filed away without knowing what to do with it. She'd looked at it from many angles in the months since and, still, wasn't sure. She asked. Now, made the question sound. 3 was still for a moment. Then it produced the sounds that meant same and here and continue. Possibly them, and still existing and forward. The vocabulary wasn't precise enough yet, at the edges to be sure. She thought she understood. The morning was cold and clear. The sky was almost the right color, or close to it, or closer than it had been. She could hear, somewhere in the middle distance, the sound of Finn doing something with the communications array. Some rhythmic clanking that was probably the recycler equivalent in IFNAF network infrastructure maintenance, and was probably essential in some way, he'd explain if she asked, and she'd probably fully follow, but would take on faith. She sat next to 3 and looked at the sky. There were 12 processors left in the network, distributed across the continent, and 6 survivor groups working on the remaining compound synthesis, and a counter-invasion fleet somewhere in the dark between here and the relay stations that was moving at the speed that physics allowed. And there was this, the morning, the cold, the clanking sound from Finn, which meant he was here, which meant they were all still here. Not all of them, not the 12 who had been 12. Not the people who hadn't made it to the hub or the relay station or any shelter at all. But some of them. Enough to keep going. Enough to keep going was what they had. Mara had learned, in geology, that time was the medium in which everything happened. Not space. Not even force. Time was what turned pressure into mountains and erosion into canyons and impossible things into the slow, ordinary facts of the world. Humans were not the strongest things on the planet. They never had been. They were the things that understood time, that could wait, plan across generations, that could take 3 months of hiding in a broken ship and turn it into a network and a proof and a signal that, light years. She thought about that. She thought about the sound 3 had made, the one that meant same here continue or them still existing forward, the one she hadn't fully translated. Maybe it didn't need translating. Maybe some things were legible without a word. The morning got brighter. Somewhere above the cloud line, an orbital fleet was looking at its atmospheric processors and recalculating. Somewhere further still, something was on its way. She reached over and made the same small, deliberate motion she'd made 3 weeks ago in the dark outside the 3rd processor. Hand adjacent to arm. Tact possible. Contact offered. 3 held still, then moved. The contact was actual. Mara looked at the sky and thought, we were 12, and then we were 5, and then we were more than we'd been, and we were still here, and we were still adding. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. That was the thing about humans, they kept adding.